All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think we'll potentially diverge in our opinions a little bit about some of these topics. So, I wanted to start on common ground. And so, I wanted to make a statement and see if you agree with it. And that is that, in my opinion, the answer is love.
Hmm.
And so, I wanted to kind of see if that's your perspective as well, or if you think that there's more than that.
Yeah, well, it's a very nuanced conversation because who can argue with that the answer is love? And yet, if there's a bomb dropping from the sky on top of your head and you're just saying, oh, I'm just going to like radiate love, well, good luck with that one, you know? So it's more nuanced than that.
For
Yeah.
sure. For sure. Okay, so yeah, the reason why I say that is that what I've come to in my journey is an understanding that for me, in my personal journey, and perhaps the answer on the world stage is that how do we learn to love wetico or wetico?
Hmm.
Because in that documentary that I mentioned, I am, that's kind of how they couch the discussion is that they talk about the problems first and then what can we do about the problems with the world, and the answer is love. And they end it by quoting, or they're showing a recording of Martin Luther King giving a speech, and he's quoting Jesus, I believe, from the Bible, talking about you must even love your enemies, and that
Hmm.
Martin Luther King saying that that's a fundamental imperative. I'm misquoting him, but paraphrasing what he said, that it's an imperative that we have to figure out how to love our enemies. And so when I learned about wetico, that's the ultimate enemy potentially. It's one way to look at it is that that's the devil.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
how does one love something that by design seems unlovable?
Yeah.
And that's been the biggest key for me as I've struggled with these questions throughout now 12 years that I've been on this journey, is coming to an understanding of, at first I'm learning about it, then I'm inevitably confronting it, and now I'm reaching a point where I'm figuring out how to love it. And in the context of the example you just gave, of a bomb dropping on your head, well, I guess there's not much you can do about it at that point, but you can choose to love those last few seconds, I guess, and think, wow,
Mhm.
that's a pretty cool way to go out if you can see the bomb dropping, I guess,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's the thing. How do you embrace something so horrific and not just using lip service saying, oh yeah, I love that, but really truly loving it the way that we experience love in a romantic capacity or in a familial capacity or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it just brings up like, whether you call it like, there's love or compassion, it's very all embracing. And, it's a natural expression of when you have the realization of what I call the dreamlike nature, which means you're seeing, the quantum field, you're seeing the wholeness, you're seeing through the imagination of separation and these horrific, dark, evil seeming parts that are showing up in the waking dream, you can recognize are parts of oneself that, if you really see that, the natural expression of that is love and compassion. But, well, not but, I would say, and, you know, both love and compassion, so many people like have this conception that, oh, if I'm really loving and if I'm lucid, that means I embrace everything and everybody, and good luck with that. I know people who've had that point of view and have gotten destroyed because they're marginalizing the part of them that has discerning wisdom and is saying, no, I need to set a boundary here. Yeah, I can love everyone. Like in alchemy, there are certain elements you absolutely do not bring into the operation. It's called the terra damnata, the cursed earth, because it's so poisonous, it'll destroy everything. And the idea being, there has to be fierce compassion. Like if you have real love, what if you see a parent abusing a kid right in front of you? Do you just go like, oh, I'm not against anything. I love everything. I love that parent abusing that kid. No, that's ignorance, So you see, that's how Wetiko can sort of hide itself in these like high sounding words like love. And so it's really because what love also requires is the fiercest discrimination and discernment. And and that's the fierce compassion compared to idiot compassion. And so yeah, I can go on a lot more, but that's just what comes up in this moment.
Yeah, and that makes me think about things like trying to reconcile what's happened in the past, trying to figure out how to take something that was horrific as a past trauma and transmute it into something that's useful now or in the future.
Right.
And I think it brings in the aspect of unconditional love versus conditional love,
Yeah.
uh, or what the Greeks call that agape love,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, the love of the divine. And that's actually something that I didn't understand until I started this journey, is what the difference was between what all forms of human love represent, I would say, versus what divine love is, the experience of divine love is like, and what that feels like, and how that can be like a medicine for transmuting traumas into gold, something useful that can potentially be. David Icke says, your life gives you your greatest gifts, brilliantly disguised as your worst nightmares.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah,
Because it brings up for me, like there was a particular very specific trauma that happened in linear historical time in my life that was like the demarcation point in my life. There was like a before and after. And I mean, I'm still in recovery, I'll be in recovery for the rest of my life, but it's actually this remembering, this retrieving of what got split off at the moment of trauma. And a major part of that, which is exactly what you were saying, is seeing the perfection of what happened instead of seeing it and blaming or feeling victimized or feeling, oh, that was evil, or having a particular story that I'm attached to or whatever. It's just sort of seeing it, not through personal eyes, but more like through transpersonal eyes, where just seeing the perfection of, wow, that actually happened, and at the point it seemed like my worst nightmare, and it seemed the opposite of divine perfection, you could say, but yet it's brought me right here to this realization of remembering who I am, that maybe I wouldn't be having this experience right now without that having happened. And all of a sudden you just see the perfection of that in a way shamanically is to be going backwards in time, and in a way changing the past, or at least the way the story you're telling about the past, which actually has an instantaneous effect on your experience in the present. And that's to really retrieve your soul. And the point is, we're all these like shamans or wounded healers in training, and we're all in that process each and every moment. Because what quantum physics is pointing us that we're actively participating in creating our experience of the world and of ourselves this moment. We're not victims. There's no one who's doing anything to us. We have a particular creative agency of how we interpret things and the meaning we place on things. And we can wield that power in a way that's in alignment with who we are, with our nature, or we could wield it in a way that's kind of egoic or out of phase. And that has ripples all throughout the multidimensional fabric of our universe. Yeah, so anyways.
yeah, it makes me, like what you said, makes me think about, I come from a perspective that there's a divine plan. So I take the fate versus the free will side of the argument, if it's going to be an argument, that everything that's happened, that everything that's happening, that everything that's going to happen was a script that was already written before we came in here. And it might seem at odds at first with quantum physics, but I think it sits very comfortable. I think quantum physics sits very comfortably within that idea, because if you step back further from quantum physics, where we're participating in it, it certainly feels like what I'm doing right now is my own free will. So the little bit that I understand about quantum physics speaks to that, how that works, how free will works, and how it combines with the rest of the field so that it's a participatory thing. But my experiences have led me to a perspective that I'm not actually the one doing any of this, that my ability to have free will boils down to my perception of how I choose to perceive something that's occurring. So it's like I'm watching a movie and yelling at the screen expecting it to change, when in fact the movie's already been written, and I can be upset as much as I want about the outcome, but it's not going to change the outcome. So what I can do is change the way I perceive how I'm reacting to it and modify that.
Yeah. See, I don't agree. I think you have a
Yeah.
real misunderstanding, about quantum physics. And it's funny because my quantum physics, the next book I have is due today, so I've been like totally steeped in
Yeah.
quantum physics. And, I mean, I can answer what you're saying, I think very simply, in that quantum physics is pointing out that the nature of this universe is indeterminate, it's probabilistic, and that it's not written in stone, it's not fated and all that, that we actually are playing a key role, in sort of creating or co-dreaming. And of course, you're also asking, what you're saying is pointing to a larger question is of who is the I that's like, either being determined or having free will. But then I want to bring in the teachings of, the Buddha and, Padmasambhava and all the great enlightened teachers in the history of the world. And they make a really interesting distinction. They say that the majority of people who think they have free will actually don't, because in a way they're, to whatever degree they're unconsciously taken over by, the unconscious, or by their unconscious complexes, or by an archetype, or just some sort of unconscious psychological force. And they can subjectively be having the experience that, oh, I'm just choosing to do this by my free will, but they're actually being puppeteered. They're
Mhm.
actually a marionette on a string. They say this is like profoundly important teaching in the Buddha Dharma. They say, oh, but then there's a state where somebody, if they have realization, there's a world of difference between compulsively just acting out something, all the while thinking that you're like just enacting your free will, compared to actually having realization of your nature, which is to have free will. And the image they use, they say, if you put your hand in the air, you can choose whichever way that you want to move it. There's no one doing that. You're doing that. You've actually connected with your nature, which is to be connected with the creative source. And see, what I'm saying is totally contradicting what you're saying.
Yeah. I had a suspicion that that would be the perspective that you would have. And I don't think for a second that I'm going to be able to explain it in a way that will just, you're going to be like, oh, you're totally right, man. It's not
Right.
free will after all. That's not what I'm trying to create anyway. Uh, and it's one of those things that no matter how much we know or we think we know as human beings, if there is a creator to this universe, which I believe there is, uh, the level of intelligence that that represents is so far beyond the human's ego and their ability to make sense of it all that we'll never know the answer, or at least not from where we're sitting right now, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But
But I'm happy that we can agree to disagree. To me, that's not problematic. That's like really a big problem I see in our world, is people having different viewpoints or perspectives, and then going to war over who has
yeah,
the right one, where, I mean, that's insanity. And so I think it's a superhero power to cultivate, to be able to have people, who you're in relationship with, who see things differently, and to be able to like still stay connected,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
I agree. Well, and from my perspective, your perspective doesn't contradict my perspective. Like I said, it sits within it as a, like the example of holding up your hand and saying, this is me doing this within a divine plan perspective. I'm supposed to believe that I'm doing that. I'm supposed to feel like I'm in control as a tool to teach me about free will, so that when I am matured to a place of divinity, let's say, then I actually have actual free will. I don't inadvertently destroy the universe by just saying, oh, well, screw it, that kind of thing.
Right.
So,
I'm just making a distinction. I'm making a distinction between somebody going like this and thinking they're having free will and having the subjective experience of having free will when they're actually just unconsciously acting something out. There's that. I'm saying that's different than somebody who's woken up in a dream and realized the dream and realized that who they've been imagining they are is just part of the dream, and that who they recognize they are is the dreamer of the dream. Then when they do this, that's a free will. That's the real free will, compared to somebody who thinks, oh, I'm acting out of free will, when they're just, being a marionette. Those are two different things.
For sure. And I appreciate that distinction, and I agree with you. And in my perspective, the person who is awakened and having this realization is choosing to co-create with the divine versus just acting unconsciously, because they're aware.
Absolutely. They're in concert. They're in
Yeah.
concert together.
Yeah. So in the Mayan astrology that I study, it's kind of the last phase of the evolution of our consciousness, is this activation of a wave of frequency that leads to conscious co-creation. And
Yep.
that's kind of where we're at now.
Right. Totally.
Is that we're in this inflection point in history where the vast majority of people are still in the unconscious state, but they're starting to break out of that and lead us into the conscious co-creation.
Yeah, no,
That
I
people,
100% agree. And the way, I think of, like, in the collected works, Jung talks about humanity as being sort of like an adolescent, psycho-spiritually in the phase of an adolescent.
yeah,
And, thankfully, some people are beginning to enter into adulthood. And yeah, absolutely. It's really where we then co-create not only with the divine, but with each other, you know.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's to bring it back to the personal relationship with Wetico, and my notion of figuring out how to love that aspect of myself. And as I
Mhm.
see it out there, uh, I don't know, it's made it easier for me to focus on Wetico as a being. And I mean, you speak to this directly in I think both books, that you can call it Wetico or you can call it the Wetico, and it can be useful to personalize it, but that it's really more of like a transpersonal thing. It's more appropriate to call it, to refer to it as Wetico or Wetico versus the Wetico. But because of the nature of my story and the way I relate to it, I've chosen to focus on it more on a personal level, specifically for myself, as I struggle against it and with it and work on understanding how it works through me. But also as I look around in my relationships and I look at what's going on in the world, uh, it just is, it's, for my journey at least, it's beneficial to think of it as a being that has an external aspect to it, even though I know that you describe it as something that's not
Right,
actually
but
real.
that's great. I'm all for that. In other words, I'll talk about the importance of sort of like, kind of putting it outside of yourself and objectifying it or personifying it, because subjectively the way we experience it oftentimes is as if it's some sort of other entity. And so from that point of view, it can be incredibly helpful to like, for example, for me, I'll be sitting in meditation, I'm all zen and chill and harmonic and all good, and all of a sudden, like, there'll be a negative emotion or wetico will come in, and I see the unconscious tendency for me to get hooked by it and identify with it, and of course, if I do that, then then I've given myself over to it, then I've given myself away, and it has power over me. But like, and all of that is just, I'm describing my own subjective experience, but it can be helpful for me when that negative emotion that has the hook that's trying to get me to take the bait and identify with it, if at that moment, if I can recognize, oh, that's as if it's another entity that's like surreptitiously come in trying to make me identify with it, if I recognize, if I see it as being like an actual other, as a person or entity or energy, that can be helpful, because
Yeah,
then the part of me that's seeing it in that way is free of it. Because I
yeah,
can only see something out there in objective form if I'm actually sort of, if I've distinguished myself from it. And so that's actually part of the exorcistic process of, on one level, of not taking the bait and getting hooked, because wetico is, in the apocryphal text, they call it the counterfeiting spirit. It presents us with this fictitious false image of who we are. And if we're not awake in that moment, oh, I'm wounded, I'm traumatized, or I'm so enlightened and grandiose, either of the extremes. And if I then am not awake in that moment and I identify with its version of who I am, well, then it has me. Then it can manipulate me and control me. But that's why I keep on pointing out, when you actually become familiar with who we are, with who you are, your nature, then it has no power over you, you know?
Yeah. Huh. Just trying to think of there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but we're a little
Yeah, but
limited.
I just so appreciate, I mean, I love that you're, not only that you've studied my work, but that you have your own really deep personal experience. And, I'm just really feeling very happy and inspired to be having a conversation, with you, because of it's based on your own personal experience. That's awesome.
I've been leaning into it hard, man. I had experiences back in 2011 when I saw that documentary and first learned the word that were so it just made me realize that this is the bottom. This is the most, I mean, that's how that documentary is really framed, is, it all comes down to one problem. All the problems of the world are based on one fundamental thing.
Yeah.
Wetico is at the core of that.
Yeah.
And it just,
Absolutely.
I don't know how or why, but I realized back then that this is the most important thing that anybody could be thinking about.
Yeah.
And I need to put as much energy into this as possible for myself. And it's been a wild ride, for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh my God. Tell me about it. I know.
But I can see now, with the benefit of only 10 years, I can imagine what it's going to be like 30 years for me to be in your shoes, 40 years in. But uh, I can see so much of a dream that has manifested that I would say is a dream, not a nightmare for me, having gone through the very challenging parts of the beginning of my journey and to where I'm at now. And there's still plenty to go, I'm sure. I mean, the world is not all peaceful and happy and loving. And so since that's an external reflection of my internal state, theoretically, then I know I've still got plenty of darkness to work out. And I don't think I'll ever be done with it. I guess that's when Buddha turns into light, or Siddhartha turns into Buddha, whatever you want to call it. That's when that process is complete.
Well,
But
what it brings up like really implicit in what you're saying is the question of who am I? Because yeah, on the one hand, like, like I'll talk about myself for a moment. Like on the one hand, there's my own darkness and my own stuff, like my personal shadow or wounds or trauma or whatever. But, then we're all not separate from the field, from the universe, from each other, ultimately speaking. And if there's darkness in the field, in the non-local field, which pervades everything, including myself, well, then that's not necessarily my personal darkness, but that's still a darkness that I'm going to be feeling because I'm not separate from that field. And that's, right away brings you into the figure of, the shaman or the wounded healer, who is takes on in a way the illness that's in the field, as a way of metabolizing it or transmuting it. So then, it's very much, this maps onto in Buddhism the bodhisattvic notion of, yeah, the bodhisattva, the one who's attaining enlightenment and they're about to step into nirvana, and then they make the bodhisattva vow because they realize, oh, I can't go into my own personal enlightenment without bringing everybody else there, because I'm realizing I'm not separate from everyone else. These are parts of me that are still in darkness. And so the idea is they return again and again to help to bring everybody into nirvana, into the enlightenment, and then they themselves can go. But it's the idea that until the darkness is emptied out in every corner of the fabric of the multidimensional cosmos, there's going to be darkness in us. So we're all a work in process. And that's actually very daunting, or it's very inspiring. That can really inspire one to be like, oh, okay, great. I see what my mission is. I see like the context of who I am.
Yeah, that's definitely the way it's been for me. Very inspiring to
Great.
and it it creates the process of shedding fear by leaning into it. You know, something that I'm afraid of, I recognize I have to lean into that if I want to bring light into that darkness. And once I do, I'm no longer afraid of it.
Exactly. And that's where, I mean, just recently I had this unbelievable dream where I wouldn't even say I was afraid. I was like in abject terror. You know, I was encountering like pure evil and it was like right in my face. And I was like absolutely like, you know, I was just like trembling in total terror and being present in that and like doing my practice and cultivating my awareness and invoking my nature. And it's just like you're saying, instead of in that terror, just like disassociating or running away or fainting or falling asleep or whatever. No, actually just presencing it. That's a very profound thing, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And then further, once you're there and you're not, because the moment that you're there, you're no longer in the state of complete fear because you're now observing the fear, witnessing the fear versus just being the fear, let's say. But then to take it one step further of like, okay, how do I love this? How do I love this? How do I incorporate this to a point where now I can see that it's actually love somehow, even though it seems impossible. That's
Yeah,
that yeah,
that's where, you know, connect when I was saying presencing, you know, being present in that experience, which means like not splitting, not
yeah,
dissociating from yourself, from, you know, your nature. And your nature, our nature is love, is compassion. That is, I mean, that's the teaching of the Buddha right there in a nutshell,
yeah,
that our true nature is love, and that that's the greatest protection against evil or against wetico, you know.
um, you know. Well, I know you got to go in a few minutes. Maybe I could leave you with one thought that we can pick up on next time.
For sure. Yeah, yeah.
Um, are you familiar with the book The Way of the Pilgrim?
Yeah, it's a really classic book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
way
yeah.
of way of a pilgrim rather. There's a quote in there that has been huge for me, and I don't remember where I think I maybe came across it in Baba Ram Dass's book Be Here Now. I think that's probably where I came across it. But anyway, the quote is, if the enemy cannot turn us from prayer by means of vain thoughts and sinful ideas, then he brings back into our minds good things that we have been taught and fills us with beautiful ideas, so that one way or another he may lure us away from prayer, which is the thing he cannot bear. It's called a theft from the right hand side.
Well, well, that's beautiful. If I can just associate for a moment around
Yeah.
that. So one of my teachers, this Tibetan Lama, was he was, you know, staying with me a few years ago in my house, you know, here in Portland, and I mean he had been on tour and anyways, so he always would meet with my students, with the people in my groups and my friends one night. And that night he was meeting with them, and I forget how he began talking about it. He began talking about, you know, just in the last little bit, one night I woke up and there was like this incredible like evil, you know, that I encountered when I woke up. And and then he didn't even, he just like let it drop and he went on to something else. So then I right away I was moderating the conversation and I brought it back. I go, so what happened when you woke up and, you know, had that encounter with evil? Like what happened? Like what did you do? And he looked astonished that I would even ask him that question. And he basically said like, well, I prayed. And you know, the subtext was, what do you think I did? I prayed. Like that was the thing to do in the encounter with evil. And I've, you know, as my process deepens, I more and more understand that. Because in a way, prayer is a way of articulating that experience of being of presencing our nature and being who we are, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I've come to understand what I didn't understand about prayer growing up, I was raised Methodist Christian, and I always thought prayer was you're just supposed to ask God for stuff.
Right.
I need this, I need that, gimme, 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 but that prayer for me now is being in the present moment, not lost in thought, and being grateful for what's being given to me at this moment.
Right.
Instead of sitting there saying, give me this, I want this, I need that. No, man, there's so much to be grateful for. If I'm
Yeah.
present and I can be aware of it, then that's the place where wetico has the least effect on me, if any.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's
Wow.
what I think it's referring to in that quote about it's the thing that the enemy cannot bear. It's a theft from its ability to steal our power.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Wow. That's beautiful.
I just want to share an image with you if you're interested. I'll share my
Yeah. I
screen.
mean, we're gonna have to, because I have to go. We're gonna have to go in a minute. But yeah.
I think it's a perfect place to end because it exemplifies that image, that quote. I don't know if you can see
Oh
that.
wow. No, I like that.
Yeah, it's like
Wow.
if it can't use evil or scare things that are scary, it sends us towards the light so that we're not in the present, and that it's like a rigged game in that regard.
Right. Wow. No, that's cool.
And I like that the artist made this image of like the traditional version of the white, the white god, well, white god too, but the god with the white hair sitting on a cloud, supposed to
Right.
be this like benevolent, being, but he made his eyes all like evil looking.
Right. Right.
I
Right.
really like that.
Totally.
So
Okay, so why don't we'll talk soon, and why don't we just be in touch and continue this conversation?
awesome, brother. Thank you so much. I appreciate the
Okay.
time today, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Yeah, totally, Patrick. Okay, so talk soon. Yeah,
Thanks,
just send
Paul.
me an email. Okay,
Well,
thanks. Okay,
thanks.
bye-bye.